Hey everyone, welcome to Food Talk Live. Today I'm incredibly honored to have Tom Philpott on the show. He is the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones Magazine. His book that just came out is called Perilous Bounty, which examines the current state of agriculture in the United States and presents solutions to prevent its inevitable collapse. So it was published this month. I'm really excited that it came out. This has been a long anticipated book for many of us in sort of the food world. Tom is also the author of two podcasts, the Bite podcast, which discusses the politics and science of what we eat through storytelling, and the Secret Ingredient podcast, which is featured on KUT 90.5 NPR in Austin, Texas. When I was describing Tom the other day to someone, I called him a modern day Upton Sinclair, who is letting us all know the truth about what's happening in the food system with his incredible writing and storytelling. And what I like most about his book, Perilous Bounty, is that it goes through a lot of the problems that we're facing in agriculture in the United States, but it also presents some really exciting solutions that are already happening. So I'm thrilled to have you here today, Tom. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Danny. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Awesome. So, I guess my first question is why write this book now? I know it was written pre-pandemic, and I'm wondering, again, why write it now, and what would you have changed if you were writing it today instead of, last year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that, the pandemic has really kind of shown us how bad we are as a society at dealing with crisis. We don't have a lot of resilience built into our society.
Right.
And the pandemic also showed just, that really kind of gross uh, extent to which corporate power plays into something like a crisis response. And I mean, everything's a little bit extreme under Donald Trump, but
Sure.
just the way that meat packing workers have been, thrust into this role as quote unquote essential workers, not given protections, and given a fig leaf by the government with this executive order that
Right.
that the administration gave. And so, in a lot of ways, I think I don't know how much I would have changed because I'm talking about crises that we're going to have to deal with going forward, and we're going to have to get prepared for. Um, I guess one thing that I would do if I had more time, and I wish that I had more time to do this, and that is expand the purview of the book to also talking about workers.
Sure.
And I allude to it. You come away from it, seeing it here and there in the book. But the book is really about how these crucial ecosystems, these really kind of highly productive landscapes, are being sacrificed to produce a lot of food in a very unintelligent way. Like
Right.
neither the regions, Central Valley of California and the Corn Belt of the Midwest, are being used in a way to produce food in a smart way to feed people.
Yeah.
And I drive that point home, but I also wish that I had been able to drive home that it's also literally consuming the bodies and lives of workers at the same time. And I think the pandemic has just sort of pushed that into our faces.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you do mention in the intro, and as you said, you allude to workers throughout. But what I liked is that you wrote, "I hope this book can serve as a weapon of sorts for the worker justice movements." And I think that's a very powerful statement because I think we need those sorts of tools. If you want a more positive instead of weapon, but those sorts of tools to use right now so that we can amplify the great work being done by the Food Chain Workers Alliance, by One Fair Wage, all of these groups that are really working to protect workers right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I wanted those groups and farm worker groups in the Central Valley, and water, clean water activists in places like Iowa, to also be able to say, not only are you ruining our lives, but you're really imperiling the food system with the way that you're doing things. So
Absolutely.
that was the idea with that.
Absolutely. Do you fear that because of COVID-19 that we're ignoring some of the other problems that you bring up in the book, like, the climate crisis and water shortages and all of the other things that industrial ag are really contributing to?
I do, and it's funny. I feel like 2020. I think if the pandemic weren't happening, I feel like the big story of 2020 would be the climate ravages that we're seeing every day.
Yeah,
I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, huge parts of the Northeast were without power from crazy hurricane. Maybe you were in Baltimore. I'm not sure if it.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
we were fine, but all of like New York, all of our friends in New
New
York lost
Jersey, New
power.
York. And then this derecho storm, comes and whips through Iowa, flattens a huge
Right,
portion of the corn crop. Now we have these fires in California, and there is fire tornadoes in California.
right.
And I feel like this would be yet another year when the climate crisis is becoming impossible to ignore. And I think that is happening, but I think that our attention is pulled away both by the pandemic and the wild politics coming out of
Sure.
the sort of news cycle coming out of Washington is just breathtaking, and I think it does take a lot of attention away from topics like my book.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, that's why this book is important. I hope folks will go out and read it. We'll give information at the end of the podcast of where folks can find it. I want to shift gears a little bit, Tom, and talk about your visit to Monsanto. And I don't know if you know, I'm from Defiance, Missouri, which is about a county over from where
Okay,
Monsanto's headquarters used to
all
be.
right,
And you talk about meeting with the then chief scientist, Rob Fraley. And I remember in 2009, I visited the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And
okay,
when I was reading your description of Monsanto, I kind of felt the same way, kind of like, this idea of going into the belly of the beast. And, when I got there and talked to folks, it wasn't so awful. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of the things that they do for
yeah.
sure. But your description of I'm wondering if you could share it with our viewers and listeners, just sort of your experience with Dr. Fraley, the whole sort of, Monsanto, image that a lot of us already have in our heads.
Yeah, so I was absolutely delighted to do that, and I can't remember. So this was a period when they were doing a lot of inviting of journalists to come, like, hey, we're transparent,
Right.
come and see us. And there was a lot of invitations going out, and I can't remember if they reached out to me, but I got a gig at Washington University in St. Louis to give a talk, and excellent professor there, Glenn Stone, who's an anthropologist who covers basically stuff like the Green Revolution in Africa. That's basically that kind of thing is his topic.
Yeah.
And so I finagled an invitation for the two of us, and we were like two large adult kids in a candy shop. We were getting to meet Dr. Fraley. He had met him he had seen him in baseball games, and they had had conversations
Sure.
before, but of course I had never. And it was just surreal. And we had his undivided attention, and we were getting this story of basically we're not really a GMO company, we're a seed breeding company. And we use GMOs only when other things fail,
Sure.
which is just surreal because they had spent the last 15 years talking about GMOs as this powerful, precise technology
Yeah.
that is the answer. And then we kind of did long conversation with Rob and some other people, and then we went on these tours to the facility. Have you ever been in the facility?
I've been at the facility in Sacramento, but
Okay.
not the headquarters. Yeah.
And so it's this vast sprawling thing, and we go section by section, and we talk to sort of the chief people at each section, and it was just I mean we were I think the thing that really got me was was we go into the biologicals division, which was a new division at that time. And so what they're doing is they're selling, like microbiota that you can put in your soil, and it's supposed to improve the productivity. And so we go into this division, and this guy comes out, and you think you're talking to Sir Albert Howard himself or Mr. Rodale. He's talking about just how important the biotic life of the soil is, how you pick up a handful of soil and there's trillions of organisms in it, and just how crucial that is. And so by this time, it's a few hours into it, and I'm feeling high, like I'm feeling stoned, just from being, and here's this surreal experience, and so we're walking around there, and there's these displays everywhere, and there's this display of their product, and their product had a couple of microbiota in it. They gave the Latin names, and then it had this really bad fungicide that I had been writing about just, I think the week before. I had written about this fungicide that is a potential neurotoxin.
Wow.
And also utterly utterly overused. It should, if you don't need to use a fungicide, prophylactically, and they were using it as a seed coating, so it's always out there in the field. Just really, really bad news. And I'm seeing that this biotic product that they're pitching is laced with also this fungicide. So they're selling fungus with fungicide at the same time.
Yeah.
And I asked him about that, and he said, that's just temporary. Soon we'll have a biological control for fungal pathogens. But to me, it's just like, oh yeah. And then the other punchline was, I went home afterwards and looked up these biotics that they were selling, and they are the most common soil biotics. Like almost any piece of soil has it. So they were selling some worthless sort of fairy dust along with a fungicide. And that kind of just, really got to the heart of the whole project for me, that, hey, this is a seed company, yes, but it's also a pesticide company, and it's in the business of moving pesticides. That analysis was borne out because despite what Fraley told me, they were actively trying to buy Syngenta for its pesticide line at that time, and they would later sell out to Bayer. But yeah, it was an extremely fun experience. I really appreciated it and loved it.
Yeah, I mean, you were at a summit that Food Tank did where we had Monsanto scientists on stage, and being able to talk to them, I think it's always valuable to talk to folks that you don't always agree with, but you can come to some sort of common ground. You can learn things like you did. I think that's important for all of us to do. I'm wondering, I get asked this question a lot, so and it's my thoughts on GMOs, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on genetically modified organisms. I mean, this is something that we've been dealing with for more than 25 years. I remember attending protests when I was in school and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering what your thoughts, as we've seen sort of the evolution of these these seeds and the herbicides that go along with them and all of that. What are your personal thoughts as a farmer too? You were you're a former farmer, probably current farmer during this time too, so I'm just wondering what you think.
I just think they end up being this really limited tool that what are we, 25 years in? So it starts in basically 95, and they've been in the development for a decade at least before that. So we're a good ways in. And in terms of just straight transgenic technology, let's set aside CRISPR and that kind of thing for now. But what have they come up with? They've come up with herbicide tolerant traits that is becoming almost a comedy. We don't want to get too much into that, but just the whole dicamba crisis, basically that killer app that made Monsanto really attractive to Bayer was dicamba tolerant soybeans, and actually a judge just vacated the EPA registration of it, so that could go to zero. I don't know how that's going to play out, but that would be a big blow to Bayer and make them regret probably even more buying Monsanto. Then you
Sure.
got BT, BT crops, this naturally occurring soil microbiota that they've taken that actually kills certain insects, and they've taken genes from it and created a BT trait. And I was just reading today about how the Western corn, basically bug pests in the Midwest are developing resistance to it. And so farmers are having to spray all kinds of stuff on it.
Right.
So those are the two great achievements. And one of them has become basically a black comedy. And the other one is, steadily, slowly unraveling. I used to write about that all the time, but I don't write
Sure.
about it as much. And I think that, like, basically, potentially an interesting tool. I think CRISPR is potentially an interesting tool, but it's foolish to put a whole lot of stock into that when there's stuff that we know works.
Right.
It's sort of
Right.
like there's these next generation nuclear power plants that might be able at some point to do something that's not as dirty as regular nuclear power, don't have
Sure.
as much waste and stuff like that. And it requires huge amounts of investment and huge amounts of government subsidies. But we know that, basically scaling up wind and solar will get us there a lot faster. And that needs
And
huge
less
investment
expensively. Yeah,
and less
exactly.
expensively. And I think that, the stuff I talk about in the book, just sort of crop diversification and things like that, we know have dramatic impacts on maintaining productivity while cutting pesticide use, while saving soil, saving water, et cetera. And so I think those are these CRISPR and GMOs are these shiny objects off in the distance that their promises are always, are always about
Right.
to see something spectacular happen that never arrives. Whereas these other things are right here before us and we can do right now.
Yeah, I totally agree on so much of that because we look at these like so-called silver bullets and we think those are the things that are going to change, and make things better. And what's really going to make things better is farmers' knowledge, the regenerative agriculture practices that you talk about in the book. Those are the game changers. And it's not these, shiny new technologies or shiny old ones too, but
Yeah.
it's the things that farmers are already doing in so many cases.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things about talking with the Fraley, and I think that was 2017 or 16, but he was already. I feel like the idea of they already backed off of the claims that, hey, this stuff is gonna feed the world,
Sure.
and it's gonna, if you don't do it, then everyone's gonna starve. I think that I got a definite, like, reduction in ambition that, hey, we're a good old fashioned seed breeding company and we're going to use good old fashioned seed breeding
Sure.
techniques. um, I thought that was really interesting, that a lot of those claims, now you're hearing them for CRISPR, and we keep hearing about how it's not nearly as precise as they were saying. And those of us who've been around for a while remember how precise GMOs were going to be and how that was going to make
Right.
all these different traits really easy. That never panned out.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other thing about, talking about GMOs over the years, they take up all the oxygen in the room. You never get to sort of, a an intelligent conversation around them. People are either, anti or for, and there's very little of that middle ground where there could be solutions. But you're right, they haven't come up with those actual solutions, and they haven't, presented a way that farmers could actually, not be sort of locked into buying these seeds and these herbicides and all of these other things. So it's just one of those things that never really lived up to its promises.
Yeah, and that's why my book, I mention them, but I don't focus on. I mean, I look at.
Yeah.
I have a chapter on Monsanto that's more as a phenomenon of industrial agriculture and an example of concentrated corporate power, but it's not a diatribe about GMOs.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier that you have farmed, you've been a farmer. Do you think that writing this book and having that perspective? I mean, I've worked on farms in the United States, I've worked on farms in other countries, haven't been a full-time farmer like you were. Do you think that changes your perspective about how you write about food and agriculture, especially in Perilous Bounty?
I do, because I think it really helps you when you go to talk to farmers.
Yeah.
You can sort of understand their language and understand the problems that they're facing really quickly. It's all kind of familiar to you. And, it's just, I think getting out there and trying to make a living farming is something that, I guess I won't say that no one should write about, food politics or ag policy without doing that. Because it is, it's quite a privilege, and it's quite a, it's a privilege to be able to do. Not everyone can.
Right.
I left a career as a journalist, in a financial journalist, to do it, and because someone close to me had family land,
Yeah.
and so not everyone has that opportunity. However, just knowing that struggle, like the struggle of I'm going to scratch a living out of this piece of dirt, I think really helps inform your perspective when you're writing about this stuff. That it is
Absolutely.
such a difficult thing, and for that reason, I can totally see why people gravitate towards stuff like Roundup Ready. Weeds are a
Sure.
pain in the ass, and
Absolutely.
here they're selling a solution that can sort out your weed problem. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but that was the allure of it, and I can totally see that allure.
Yeah, farming is definitely hard work, and uh, farmers are seeking all sorts of different solutions. I'm wondering, going back to sort of big ag for a minute, do you think that they can be part of the solution? I mean, you talk about so many solutions in your book, and I want to get to those, but do you think that there's a role for big corporations and big ag to be part of the solution when we're talking about some of these problems?
That is a really great question. And I think the problem is that farming, no matter what, is a low margin business. And if any, giant, if a company is able to get big enough and powerful enough to make billions of dollars worth of profits in farming, then I'm immediately suspicious of them. And
Sure.
because it's just adding one more layer between the farmer and selling food to people, or providing food to people, and is just creating all these layers. And so many of this, one thing that I despair about is that so many of the solutions I write about, essentially diversification, growing more crops than just two in the Midwest, et cetera. They cut way down on agrochemicals. And so where does that leave, if your seed industry is completely tied in and the same as your pesticide industry? How are they going to be breeding seeds for a program, for a farming style that promises to cut herbicide use by 80%, or basically make fertilizer something you need on the margin and not
Sure.
the main thing, a major business expense? And so I think the incentives are, I'm just trying to think of how a company could make lots of money off of sustainable, some kind of
Yeah.
agriculture that's low input. It's hard for me to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You brought up the issue of diversification, and what a lot of folks, I hate to say on the other side of this, but they talk about comparative advantage and how different regions should be growing different crops and really focusing on those. And you say that that's a mirage, this idea of comparative advantage. And I'm wondering if you can explain that.
Yeah, so I think comparative advantage itself, I think it's a perfectly fine concept, but I think that oftentimes when someone is making a comparative advantage analysis about farming or about food production, a lot of stuff gets left out or just sort of assumed away. And so, California, great example, there is a lot of comparative advantage. California, it's got a Mediterranean climate. It's
Sure.
got this, grand Sierra Nevada mountain range that collects, basically a huge portion of the weather coming out of the South Pacific ends up dumped as snow there, especially for a few months out of the year. And, because of political power, it's got a big claim on the Colorado River too, in the southern part of the state. And so these are comparative advantages that are to be reckoned with. It's also, we should say that having access to, for its entire history, essentially low wage labor from Mexico is a huge comparative advantage for California. Ruthlessly exploited in general. Major source of labor there. Okay. But what gets left out is, so these water resources, are they being used widely? Are they being used wisely? Are they being used in a sustainable way? And that is the flaw I came up with in my book.
Sure.
That basically water there, if you're going to do a comparative advantage analysis of California as to why it should be such a big vegetable producer and fruit producer, you've got to figure out a way that water is being used in a way that within sort of the bounds of the resource. And we've gotten so far out of the bounds of the resource. And so, I try to make pains to say in the book, I'm not saying farming should be eliminated in California, or that the U.S. food supply should not rely on California at all. So what I say is that we should ease up our reliance on California.
Sure.
And sort of let the farmers in that state and policymakers figure out a balance where the water is not being drawn down at such a crazy clip.
Absolutely. I want to turn to solutions because that's where this conversation is going, and you highlight the Green New Deal as a step in the right direction. And I'm wondering if you can explain your thoughts about that deal and what it can really do for farmers and for agriculture.
So what excited me so much about it was the strategy of it was basically that climate policy in the United States has been, basically captured by the fossil fuel industry. Can't do much about climate change in the US. It's been tried and slapped down because of this massive lobby. And the same with food policy and agribusiness. The Farm Bill, Danny, you've been around and, covering farm bills and, experiencing them as they play out. And there's never any real reform on the table. There's tweaks at the edge.
Yeah.
There's just throw a little money to this or that good program, but the basic structure sort of keeps this machine in place. And there's a massive lobby behind that. And it's the same companies that we were just talking about. And so what the Green New Deal does is it says, okay, let's skirt around them by involving social movements. And the theory of change here is that we're gonna amass public support and like literally demonstrations and people in the street behind, and so put that up against your sort of K Street lobbying shop or your campaign finance shop. So that's the theory of change behind it. And I think that is an exciting thing to see in mainstream American politics, because the old way, I covered the Waxman-Markey climate bill in 2009, and the amount of, putting aside the fossil fuel industry, the amount of agribusiness muscle flexing in that fight was jaw-dropping. They got everything they wanted, and then the fossil fuel industry killed it anyway. And so the Green New Deal, the actual document was pretty vague, but there have been things that have been floated since. And I think the most detailed roadmap has been in Bernie Sanders' platform that he put out in 2019. Mm-hmm. And, it basically has a bunch of stuff in there that would be great. Basically breaking up these big agribusiness companies, paying farmers for things like crop diversification, figuring out a way to pay for storing carbon in the soil that isn't some cap and trade scheme, but that is actual, it's actually leading to reductions in greenhouse gas, and the public is sort of footing the bill for it. And also a big jobs program. And I think that the jobs program has become so much more relevant because of the pandemic.
Right.
We already had a lot of underemployment, but now we have massive unemployment.
Yeah.
And, something like the restaurant industry. Maybe I heard someone say on one of your food take summits that, some huge amount of restaurants are going to go out of business. Think of the workforce
Tom
that's going to be on
Colicchio
the
talked about
street.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so a jobs program that is tied into rebuilding or building a sustainable agriculture program in the United States, I think is a great idea. And I think this crisis, as horrible as it has been, could be an impetus for,
Right.
we've seen that people care they care about racism. We've seen this incredible upsurge of demonstrations around racism. And
Right.
I think a jobs program is going to get a lot of people excited. And whether Mr. Biden cares about it or not, he's going to have to care about it in 2021 if the present trends continue. That is assuming
Right.
that he wins.
Right. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
But we're a nonpartisan organization, so I just
Yes.
have to remind folks that.
Yeah.
I know Senator Harris is very interested in workers and has marched with UFW and others. I mean, do you have are you hopeful about her being on the ticket as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really good stuff with food policy, and there's a great Civil Eats piece about it, and a couple days ago, and she very impressively has signed on to this Cory Booker Elizabeth Warren bill that would put a moratorium on CAFOs, on factory
Right.
farms. All that stuff is absent from the Biden platform and the DNC platform and Biden's material, but she's got some great food policy chops in
Right.
there. So I think that is something to be hopeful for. And California did something that shouldn't be radical, but it is radical. It extended minimum wage protections to farm workers and taking away, or at least limiting part of California's comparative advantage with regard to labor. And also made it to where you have to pay time and a half overtime to farm workers, which, in other words, welcome to the New Deal. I don't know, almost 100 years too late. And she has sponsored legislation to make that nationwide because other states, some places farm workers don't have those protections at all. And so, yeah, there are some things to be hopeful about in her food policy positions for sure.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, your book focuses on the U.S. and I know you did that for, that's your area of interest. Do you think that, countries in the global South can learn from sort of our mistakes and not follow them in terms of what we've done with food and agriculture in this country?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think definitely, but I think we're still seen as this country that figured out food. That I think, and I think the development model, basically our model of hog production has been embraced in China, and China is rapidly, and has been for a while, rapidly scaling up hog production along U.S. lines. And I think that's part of the reason why the Chinese government bought Smithfield, the giant U.S. pork producer, to sort of technology transfer, as well as having a source of pork imports from the U.S. So I think the answer is yes, but we still are, we have been this sort of beacon to policymakers, and we have stuff like USAID and the State Department pushing these ideas, and basically saying, basically keeping up the tradition of the Green Revolution, which is, buy these improved seeds and chemicals, and all of your problems will be solved. So I think there's a lot of inertia to get around, and I think we're still in a position where there are other countries that we can learn from. Like, I don't know, one of the over in the Argentine Pampas, there's a region very similar to our Corn Belt that they're unfortunately mimicking our Corn Belt by putting in monocrops of corn and soybeans.
Sure.
But they have a great system of rotating cows through doing incredible grass-fed beef and doing a corn crop in the rotation, but not making it the dominant thing. I think there are things that we can learn. I think we're still in a position that we have a lot to learn. But
Absolutely.
I think, critiques like mine and others, can kind of put the lie to the idea that, hey, we've sorted out our food problem. We've put off our food problem, but we've also wrapped up in enormous amount of environmental damage in the process.
And health damage and
Oh yeah.
absolutely, and worker damage, all of these
Oh
things,
yeah.
humane and
Yeah.
inhumane treatment of animals, all of these other things. Before I ask the final question, I want to make sure folks know how to get in touch with you. They can go to tomphilpott.net. They can go to motherjones.com. They can go to thesecretingredient.org. Where can folks buy your book, Tom?
They can
Where
buy
do you
it.
want them to buy your book?
Okay,
Is
where
what
do I
I
want
should
them to
ask.
buy it? There's a thing called bookshop.org, and it I believe some of the proceeds go to independent bookstores, and I've heard really good things about it, and I think it's fairly price competitive with the company that shall not be named.
Sure.
So I think bookshop.org would be a great place to go, and also
Great.
your local bookstore. Wear a mask. And make sure that it's got a good display. Every author wants to go to the bookstore and make sure that there's a display. But
Right.
be my sort of supporters out there and make sure that it's. But I think that's
Yep.
probably the best place is your local bookstore, and then bookshop.org.
Great. So I'm wondering, Tom, if we can, and we'll have all those, we'll have all those websites available on our social media and foodtank.com. So if you didn't have a chance to write them down, we'll make sure you get them. I'm wondering, given what we've seen happen over the last 6 months, what your predictions are for the rest of 2020 and
Oh man.
2021. What do you sort of seeing? What do you think will happen?
I am someone who is very worried about the economic situation. And I'm also worried about the lack of, just a testing regime to get this pandemic under control.
Sure.
And I think those are super interrelated. And so I really, they took away the $600 a week supplement and unemployment
Right.
insurance, and they haven't been back to pass anything else. And I'm a good Keynesian. I think that that right now we should be pumping money into the economy to support people, workers, and people who can't work.
Sure.
And I think we should also be pumping money into a testing regime. And so here's where we get to my prediction. If we don't do those things, then I honestly don't see how we avoid a Great Depression like reckoning. And I think that what's great is that there's a quote from Milton Friedman that when there's a crisis, policymakers revert to ideas that are lying around, and that's a big part of Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine. And I think we have some great ideas lying around. I think the Green New Deal is just
Right.
sitting there, and Bernie's proposal, and John Maynard Keynes and the experience coming out of the Great Depression is
Sure.
there. And so I think it's just like people are asking me, oh my God, how can we solve the crazy the problems that you bring up in your book? And my answer is always, it's actually that we know what to do. It's just sort of basically diversification. The real problem is political and political economy, and how to get past these giant lobbies. And so I think that I am terrified of the economic crisis that I think is coming, but I'm hopeful that we'll figure out. We have the tools and the means to get beyond it as a society and actually emerge from it stronger as a society.
Yeah, no, that's a great note to end on. I am very hopeful that we have the tools and the knowledge and the folks who can do these things and help us get through this. And I'm so grateful to you as a storyteller. I do believe that we need more storytellers so that these things are known. So thank you, Tom, for all of the work that you've done over the years. I've learned so much from you. You continue to be a beacon of hope in a really dark time. So thank you so much. And I'll continue to read and listen to you. And I hope folks will join me on our next live cast when I'll be talking to Matt Joswiak of Rethink Food. Thank you so much, Tom. Please stay well.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciated our conversation.
Me too. Thank you.
All right.